Well, we are approaching the end of Daniel. We'll be in chapter 12 tonight, so go ahead and turn there, Daniel 12. I hope the study has been helpful for you and that maybe you've learned some things about the book of Daniel that you hadn't realized. And that's been an encouragement to you, looking at the life of Daniel and his friends and their faith and their commitment to the Lord. Let's recall where we are. It seems like it's been forever since we've been in Daniel, doesn't it? Seems like a long time. We just missed last week because of a different lesson, because we were in VBS. But remember that chapter 10, 11, and 12 go together. And we've been looking at chapter 11, which is an incredibly detailed prophecy about many things that were going to happen looking forward from Daniel's time. Very detailed. And we didn't get into all of those details. I'm not sure that I'm able to do that. But we saw some of the major themes in chapter 11 of what was going to unfold in history from Daniel's time forward. And so we looked at, just as a brief review in chapter 11, there were more kings in verse 2 that were going to arise in Persia. Then we transitioned into the Greek period. As we've seen throughout the book, the Greeks were coming. We looked at Alexander the Great early in chapter 11, and then the four kingdoms that came out of his reign. We talked about a lot of the squabbling and fighting and civil war and all this mess, all of this drama, especially between the king of the south and the king of the north, so the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And then very importantly, as you get over into verse 30 and following, we began to talk about Antiochus Epiphanes again and all the horrible things that he did. And then, if you'll remember, last time we discussed what I believe is happening here is we're moving on to Rome. We're not talking about Antiochus as we go deeper into chapter 11. As we get past verse 36, it doesn't match. It doesn't fit with what happened in history if you're thinking of this as Antiochus Epiphanes. But as I tried to show you last time, it fits Rome very well. The history really lines up and tracks right along with what we see at the end of chapter 11. So come to 11:45, the last verse of chapter 11. And I'm proposing to you that we're talking about the Roman emperors. And he says in 45, he will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. The Romans established their power in Judah. That's what we're seeing here in 45. They pitched their tents between the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and the holy mountain of Jerusalem. They have established their power. And then we roll right into chapter 12 and verse 1. We're still talking about all the same thing here as we get into chapter 12, but we're drawing the prophecy to a close. And he says in verse 1, "Now at that time Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued." At that time. It's a big question. At what time? And again, I think we're talking about the time of the Romans. It's consistent with what we've seen throughout the book: Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, in multiple prophecies in the book. And so at that time of what happened back in verse 45, what's going to happen at that time in verse 1? Take it one statement at a time. What's the first thing we see that's going to happen? Michael will arise. Who's Michael again? Yes, he's an angel. He's the archangel. And what is he going to do? Or what is his function? Yeah, he's going to stand guard over the people of God. He's going to arise to do that. That's one of his roles. He will arise to watch over them. And then look at the second half of verse 1. And there will be a time of distress. How bad is this going to be? The worst, right? Yes, distress is never nice. This is really bad distress, isn't it? Such as has never occurred, he says. Since there was a nation until that time. It's really bad, whatever they're talking about here. And at that time, your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. Well, it kind of sounds like we're talking about the end of time, doesn't it, in a way? The book of life, everyone whose name is in the book of life. But remember that phrase, at that time. So what do you do with that? If we are talking about the time of the Romans, and I believe we are. Well, there's another clue here in verse 1. Is there anything here that sounds familiar to you? And I'll just, instead of fishing, I'll just tell you what I'm looking for. A time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. Have you heard that before somewhere else? Yeah, good. Matthew 24. Doesn't Jesus say these words? A time of distress such as never been seen before. Let me show you that. Let's go over to Matthew 24. And what I want to do tonight is spend a good amount of time in Matthew 24 because it has a lot of connections to Daniel. So we remember several weeks ago we looked at Revelation 13, Revelation 17. Notice the connections with Daniel. I want to do the same tonight with Matthew 24. And just look at what Matthew 24 is about, because I think it's a very misunderstood passage. But if you look at Matthew 24, I think it's verse 21. But let me get over here and check. Yeah. Jesus here is speaking. And he says, "For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will." Well, that sounds much like what we saw in Daniel, doesn't it? And not only that, if you look over at verse, let's see. Well, I have this written down somewhere. He talks about the abomination of desolation. 15. Yeah, thank you. Verse 15. "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand." So Jesus is quoting from Daniel, talking about the abomination of desolation. Have we seen that phrase in Daniel? You may have to think back. It's been a couple weeks. But in chapter 11, we saw in connection with Antiochus Epiphanes the prophecy about he's going to set up the abomination of desolation. And you remember what Antiochus did. He took over the temple and he spread the pig blood all around and set up the altar to Zeus and all of that stuff. It's the abomination of desolation. Well, Jesus says, quoting from Daniel, that's coming again. Let the reader understand. So, just to point out here that there are connections, deep connections with the book of Daniel. Let's back up to Matthew 24 and verse 1. I thought this would be as good a time as any to talk about this chapter. Jesus came out from the temple, and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." What are we talking about here? Just right from the verses. Yeah. They're looking at the temple, and Jesus says not one stone is going to be left on another here in this temple. So keep in mind what we're talking about as we go through. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us when these things will happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Naturally, they want to know when. Jesus, when is this going to happen? I mean, the stones of the temple were massive, humongous stones. Jesus, when is this going to happen? What are going to be the signs that this is going to happen? Now, a lot of people look at Matthew 24 and they think, well, this is about the end of time. This is about the final judgment. This is about the end of the world. But let's look at the verses and see if that bears out or if there's something else going on here in this chapter. Look at verse 4. And Jesus answered and said to them, "See to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will mislead many." Oh, Jesus says there's a time coming. People are going to show up and say, "I'm the Christ." Don't listen to them. What else is going to happen before that time? Look at verse 6. "You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these are merely the beginnings of birth pangs." What's going to happen before the temple is destroyed and not one stone is left upon another? Just kind of summarize 6 through 8 for me. What are we going to see? What were they going to see? Wars? Yeah, right? Yeah. Calamity, wars, earthquakes, right? Famines. Oh, right. Yeah. Troublesome times are here. Yeah. I had something back here. False teachers, right? So let's read on and then we'll come back. They will deliver you to tribulation, verse 9, and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. So there's going to be great persecution of the people of God whenever this is that Jesus is talking about. Verse 10, "At that time many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand." He said, you know Daniel, you know what Daniel said. When you see that happen, watch out, right? Look at 16. "Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out of that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days." Let's pause there for a second. Flee to the mountains. When you see the abomination of desolation, what's he say? You run for your life. You get out of the city. You flee. Go to the mountains. If you're on your housetop, don't worry about your belongings. Don't go back and get them. You just run for your life. And so Jesus, remember, he's telling them these are the signs, these are the things that are going to happen before the temple is destroyed. Well, it's interesting to note that in Luke's version of this teaching of Jesus, Luke 21, instead of saying the abomination of desolation, because Luke was written to more of a Gentile audience, they wouldn't have known what Daniel the prophet had said. And so he describes it a little differently, and he says, in the same place here, when you see the armies surrounding Jerusalem, get out, run. Don't even stop to get anything, just get out. Go to the mountains. And so people that were familiar with the book of Daniel and familiar with what happened at the time of Antiochus Epiphanes and his armies that came and surrounded Jerusalem, Jesus says you're going to see the same thing again. And notice as he continues in verse 19, woe to those who are pregnant, those who are nursing babies in those days. How fun is it to flee to the mountains when you're pregnant and nursing a baby? Carrie, sound like much fun? No, definitely not. And he goes on, verse 20. Pray that your flight will not be in the winter. How fun is it to flee to the mountains in the middle of winter? Or on a Sabbath day, he says. Why that? Why pray that it's not on a Sabbath? Because the gates of Jerusalem would have been locked. And here you are trying to flee. 21. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Saying exactly what Daniel had said. So, question. If Matthew 24 is about the return of Jesus, the end of time, the final judgment, what good is fleeing to the mountains going to do you? Right? How is that going to help? Why does he say, don't go back and get your stuff, but just get out of the city? Why is getting out of the city going to help you if this is the end of time? Right? So you begin to see, maybe this is not about the end of time in the final judgment, because the earth is going to be burned up with intense heat, and all of that, the universe is going to go away. Flee to the mountains, what good is that going to do? So we must be talking about something else here, and let me show you some more evidence of that. Come down to verse 32. Let's start there. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. There's signs in the fig trees that summer is coming. And he's saying, I'm telling you there are signs about what's about to happen to Jerusalem too. Learn the signs. Verse 33. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Now listen to 34. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. When is all of this going to happen? In their lifetime. The people that Jesus is talking to, he says, your generation will not pass away until all of these things take place. So are we talking about the end of the world? The end of time? We're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And that begins to make sense. You see the armies surrounding Jerusalem, you get out. Because we know how bad it was for the Jews who were left in Jerusalem. And it was a time that was so horrendous, it's like nothing that had ever been seen before. And Josephus, the historian, talks about some of the details about how horrific it was. And I'm not going to mention them here because it's stomach-turning. It's horrendous, the things that happened. But I will say that history tells us about 1.1 million Jews were killed. 1.1 million. And about 79,000 were carted off into captivity, slavery. And it was a horrible time. But you know, there's very interesting history here. This is an article that I have called The Fall of Jerusalem, written by someone at Apologetics Press. And it was a very good article. And, you know, he goes through and he talks about some of these signs that Jesus is saying. Watch for this. There's going to be war. There's going to be famine. There's going to be earthquakes, etc. Well, what about the false prophets, the false Christ that came onto the scene? Josephus wrote that there were many of those. And during the reign of Felix, which was about 52 to 60 AD, there were so many false prophets and people out just duping the people and robbing the people and claiming to be Christ. It says that Felix caught them and put many of them to death every day. People who were coming on the scene saying that they were the Christ. So here we are about 50 or 60 years after Jesus ascends to the Father. And you have all of these false prophets coming on the scene. What about all the wars that Jesus said? Watch for the wars that are going to happen. Tacitus, who was a Roman guy, he wrote in the months leading up to AD 70 that strife raged during this time. He said, I am entering on the history of a period rich in disasters, frightful in its wars, torn by civil strife, and even in peace it's full of horrors. 4 emperors perished by the sword. There were 3 civil wars. There were more with foreign enemies. And, you know, Josephus himself wrote an entire book called The Jewish Wars. So there was just war after war after war, just like Jesus said before Jerusalem was destroyed. What about famine? Remember, he said there's going to be famines, there's going to be earthquakes before this day. Tacitus also wrote in AD 51, this year witnessed many prodigies. Houses were flattened by repeated earthquakes. Further portents were seen in shortages of corn, resulting in famine. He talks about pestilence that came upon the city, upon the people. Suetonius documented that a series of droughts had caused a scarcity of grain. In the book of Acts, actually, in chapter 11, you remember Agabus the prophet, who foretold a great famine throughout the whole world that was coming. And so, yes, we see wars, we see famine, we see earthquakes, many earthquakes. And so the disciples of Jesus are supposed to be watching this and thinking, you know, maybe this is the signs, just like on a fig tree, that summer is coming. There are signs here. What about persecution of the disciples? Well, you just have to read the book of Acts, right? There was all kinds of persecution of disciples. And then finally, Jerusalem was surrounded by armies. In 66 AD, there was a Roman general named Cestius. He brought a massive army to Jerusalem, surrounded Jerusalem. And history notes that he could have ended the Jewish-Roman war right there if he would have just struck. He could have ended it all. And so what did he do? He packed up and left. And no one knows why. Josephus writes, and he says, this was without any reason in the world, that he took up his armies and he just took them away and they left Jerusalem. There was no reason for it from the human perspective. But from God's perspective, and from Michael, who's guarding over the people of God, what did this give them an opportunity to do? Run. And the Christians saw this. They knew the teaching of Jesus. And so the armies left and they ran. And they left Jerusalem and got out. And history records that no Christians were killed during the takeover of Jerusalem. because they were watching the signs. They saw that abomination of desolation coming again. And so Matthew 24 is about this, the destruction of Jerusalem. And I've thought in the past 2 years ago that it was about the end of the world, but it just doesn't really fit, does it? The end of time, it just doesn't really fit. So let's pause there. Questions or comments that you have? Yeah, Jim. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. You could see it all happening just as Jesus foretold. And so Jesus comes, right? But we're not talking about the second coming. He's coming in judgment. And the Bible uses language like that. It's not always about the second coming in the end of the world, the end of time. Jesus came in judgment on Jerusalem. Other questions or comments? Ben. Right. Right. Yes, that's a good point. We'll know when Jesus comes again. It's going to be obvious to all. He's going to come like a thief in the night, but we'll know when he comes. Dave. Right. Right. Yes, it's going to be very, very clear, very obvious to all. Bob.
You know, it's kind of like back in the book of Joel. Joel's children, they weren't really paying attention to their surroundings. They were arguing, doing this, doing that.
Yeah.
They weren't paying attention. And destruction come on them.
Right. Yeah. Not paying attention, and destruction came upon them. That's very true. Thankfully, people were paying attention to Jesus' words. And the siege of Jerusalem in AD 70 under Titus happened during the time of the Passover. So there were all kinds of people in the city, and it was horrendous. Quite horrendous. Well, let's come back to Daniel then. I just wanted to show you those connections and sort of get you to thinking about Matthew 24. Come back to Daniel 12. Now let's look at verse 1 and 2 again in this, knowing what we've seen. Now at that time, Michael, the great prince, who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time, your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. Well, doesn't that sound like the end of the world? It does, doesn't it? People rising out of the graves, right? Sounds like the end of time. And I will grant you that for sure. However, this sort of language about resurrection is sometimes used in a figurative sense. For example, you probably have a footnote in your Bible over to Ezekiel 37, which is the Valley of Dry Bones. Do you remember the story of the Valley of Dry Bones? And Ezekiel has a vision of these dry bones, and they're just lifeless, of course, and God puts flesh on them and breathes life into them, and they're resurrected again. And it's a picture of hope that God is saying, I'm going to return the nation back from Babylon. You're going to come back from this. There's going to be a victory. And so the resurrection is used in a figurative sense in that passage. You see it's a similar thing if you look at John chapter 5, and you don't have to turn there, but you can if you'd like to. But in John 5, 24 and 25, Jesus says there, "An hour is coming, and now is, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live." So Jesus says the dead are going to live again. And he says the time is now. It now is here as he's speaking. So that's not talking about the final resurrection, that we're actually raised and given new bodies. It's talking about, in a spiritual sense, people who hear the voice of Jesus are going to, those who accept it, will rise from the dead. They'll have new life again. And then Jesus says right after that, don't marvel at this, because a time is coming, not here yet, a time is coming when the bodies will actually be raised out of the graves. I'm paraphrasing. That's in John chapter 5. So he uses resurrection in a figurative spiritual sense, and then he goes on to talk about, and then there's also coming a time when people are actually going to be raised out of their graves. Russell? Right. I think it could, and that would be in a literal sense. There were people actually literally raised from the graves at the time of Jesus. And again, this was in the period of the Romans, right? So it's a good thought. So he could be talking figuratively here, as in people are going to hear the message of Jesus and they're going to have new life. They're going to be raised from the dead spiritually. Or actually, people were raised from the dead at the time of the cross. But again, this is at that time. Look back at verse 1 again. At that time, during the time of the Romans, the time when the kingdom was going to come in, that boulder that smashed everything else, that was at the time of the Romans. The kingdom of God came in. Verse 3, those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, and those who lead the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But as for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the book until the end of time. Many will go back and forth, and knowledge will increase. You seal up the book. In other words, some versions say close up the book, or roll up the scroll and seal it. Preserve it. Preserve it, because people are going to want to know about these things. And people search the book of Daniel very intently to know about these things. So preserve the book. Verse 5. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others were standing, one on this bank of the river, and the other on that bank of the river. And one said to the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, how long will it be until the end of these wonders? How long? When is this all going to take place? When is it all going to be over? Verse 7, I heard the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, as he raised his right hand and his left toward heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it would be for a time, times, and a half time. And as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. When is it all going to be over? And we've talked about this already a little bit. When are all the events of chapters 11 and 12 going to be completed? According to verse 7. What's he say? This is important. Yes. with the shattering of the power of the holy people. What does that sound like? The destruction of Jerusalem, AD 70. All of these things will be completed. So if you take it in that way, and I think it's very natural to take it that way, I think it's logical, then we're back to in verse 2 with the raising of the dead. It's in a figurative sense, or perhaps as Russell was mentioning, the literal raising at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. We're in the Roman period, though. Does that make sense to you? And I'll admit, it's highly debated. And some believe that this is about the end of time and so forth. And I'm just telling you that I don't see it that way based on my studies. But you don't have to believe like I do. You search it for yourself, right? Russell. Right, yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. And I think it's also true that, as you mentioned, Revelation, at the end of Revelation, talks about time still in the future for us. And so perhaps one could argue, well, that's what's happening here in Daniel 12. But I don't see it that way, personally. So I just wanted to present some evidence to you and get you to thinking about it. Any other comments or questions before we close? We're going to finish up Daniel next week. So not many verses to go, but they're difficult. They're difficult verses. And we'll take a look at that next week. And then I'm thinking we'll probably start a study on the Holy Spirit after we're done with Daniel. I'm open to suggestions there, but that's kind of the direction I'm heading, have been for a while. So I think that'll be a profitable study for us. All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you all for your attention, and we'll see you on Sunday, Lord willing.